before I turn things over to Shuv Majumdar to lead the Q&A, I'm just going to recognize a few people who are in the room. We're delighted to have every one of you, let me assure you. But we're delighted to have David Cooper from the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, Dick Fadden, a former Deputy Minister of Defense, head of CSIS, National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister, Tom Foster, the Managing Partner from Audrey Berntsen, Gita Kalmut, who's of course the Ambassador from Estonia, David Kilgore, a former MP and Minister. We've got Richard Marceau, also from CIJA, and Martin Sampson, and of course Harry Weldon. Where's Harry? The founder of Peace, Order, and Good Government, a wonderful discussion group here in Ottawa. The fact that I may not have mentioned you doesn't mean that I don't think you're a terribly important person, right? But we couldn't name everybody. So thank you so much for coming. And now I'm going to ask Shuvaloy Majumdar, who is head of our foreign policy work at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, to come up and moderate the Q&A.
Thanks, Mark.
Shuv.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank you, Jamie, for a provocative talk and for what I understand is a beautifully written book. There's only 20 copies in the back, so I'm going to plug you a little bit and encourage those of you closest to the exit to make sure you grab your copy. Jamie will stay after this Q&A session to sign some of them, ideally with nice things for our guests here. You covered a lot of subjects, and I was struggling to try and pick up which one I'd like to start with. I think it's probably appropriate to look at the recent realignment of the Turkish position. The alignment between Ankara and Moscow has been a fairly recent advent. The autocratization of Erdogan has been a long ambition that seems to be inching closer to success from his perspective. The 2015 refugee crisis that you had certainly delved into with substantive detail, in some parts could be accused to have been initiated by him, allowing an influx of refugees to come through. We know that he's threatened that similar things might happen against Angela Merkel. This is a NATO partner. This is, in theory, an economic partner of the European Union. I'm just curious what your reflections are of what's happening to the Turkish state.
I'm not an expert on Turkey, so I can't offer much. I think it's clear that Mr. Erdogan is not interested in making his country into a European state. And so whether or not we officially cut off the talks between Ankara and Brussels about joining the EU or not, I think it should be evident to everyone that he's not interested in this. And we should really stop with the kind of self-flagellation over whether or not we alienated him soon after he came to power. I think he had this idea from the beginning that he really wanted to turn Turkey into some kind of neo-Ottoman empire. But as you say, it's a very difficult question because they are NATO members. And I'm not sure that the same geopolitical reasons for why Turkey was a member of NATO during the Cold War, if those conditions are still present today. I mean, Turkey wanted to be a part of NATO because they were fearful of communist encroachment during that period of time. We live in a different world now. And so I'm not sure if Turkey can be really seen as a reliable NATO ally anymore. The results of the election, which may be rigged, we don't know if it was fair or not. This is the constitutional referendum that occurred. What was most worrying to me was not the vote in Turkey, it was the vote of Turkish expats living in Europe, who voted overwhelmingly in favor of this referendum at higher rates than citizens of the Turkish Republic living in Turkey. And this, to me, is just a real major indictment of the European integration model. If they have, large Turkish populations who are living in and enjoying the fruits of European liberalism and democracy, if those people can vote to basically empower a dictator back in their homeland, I mean, I don't know what more evidence you need to say that this has just been a failure.
Okay. Another question is about the populist sentiment that we are seeing emerge throughout Europe, while they have not yet fully arrived in positions of power to execute on their platforms. They're certainly tapping into a sense of insecurity within European society. And you touched upon it a little bit. And the debate that we've seen in the last few years has resulted with one side, usually the elite, acting with a sense of condescension when it comes to the perspectives of the rural, the poor, the blue-collar type of constituencies that these populist parties are beginning to tap into. Meanwhile, these populist parties are tapping into a genuine anger. What is it that these people are angry about? And are there leaders on the landscape in Europe that you think can marshal those sentiments in a constructive way towards an integrated Europe as you're describing? Or is that just something that's completely absent in Europe today?
I think there are several things. Probably the most important is this economic stagnation, and in the fact that you have youth unemployment in some countries like Spain or France, which is like 30 to 40%. And that is something that can be fixed by, that's not something that should be blamed on Brussels in my mind. That is a failure of French political leaders and the French people, frankly, to undertake the reforms necessary to create a dynamic, growing economy. The reason why it's so difficult for young French people to get hired is because it's so impossible to fire people in a country like France. So I know that this word neoliberal it's such a curse word now, but I think they probably need more neoliberal economics to address that. I think another element of this is, I think all of us, I think we just vastly underestimated the appeal of ethnic identity as a motivating political force. I think we just sort of assumed, and it's easier when you're living in a country like Canada or America, or if you live in cities in Canada or America where it's so ethnically diverse. It's very difficult for you to process how people could think politically or see ethnic identity as a motivating political factor. And I think for a lot of people in a world that's increasingly globalizing and it's becoming more cosmopolitan, where there's more people moving across borders than they ever have before, for a lot of people, ethnic identity is an anchor. And we just sort of assumed, in the 90s that this would just sort of fritter away and that people wouldn't think this way anymore. But they clearly do. And I think that explains a lot of the Donald Trump phenomenon, frankly. I think he was really making appeals based on racial resentment. And I'm not going to, and so I'm hesitant to apologize for that. I know there's this, among people who oppose Donald Trump in my country, there's been this sort of, oh, woe is us. Did we not listen to these people enough? Did we not take their concerns into account? And I think a lot of it really had to do with racism. I just do. And I don't think that should be legitimized. And I think that's what is driving a lot of the appeal for someone like Marine Le Pen as well. In terms of leaders who can counter it, I mean, in France there is Emmanuel Macron, who seems to be very progressive and forward-looking and pro-European. But there's a part of me that just thinks he's not really capturing the zeitgeist right now. The zeitgeist is Brexit and Trump and Le Pen. That's really where things are going. And so I'm not sure if that is going to be enough to stanch the tide, if you want.
Fair. We've seen recent reports about the subjugation of sexual minorities in Chechnya, Moscow's, the Kremlin's general indifference. You were brave about what you did on Russian television on this. Can you explain to us a little bit more why this is such an important thing for us to focus in on in Chechnya? And Canada for a while had created an underground current for gays in Iran to find a safer place to live here. That program has recently been closed. Could that be something that Canada offers to those who are being persecuted in Russia?
So you're referring to these reports that have come out about sort of the rounding up of gay men in Chechnya by the warlord who basically runs that province, a guy named Ramzan Kadyrov, who's just a monster. And I think it's important to note that a lot of these sort of diplomatic condemnations that have been coming out have been condemning Chechnya and calling on Chechen authorities to investigate. And I think it's important that we say Russia. Chechnya is a part of Russia. It's not an independent country. And I say this because there was a statement that came out of our State Department or it was the UN mission, one of the two, where the word Russia was not even mentioned in any of these statements. And so I think we need to remember that it's Russian authorities who are ultimately responsible for this. And why it matters is because I think, look, any country that treats its own people this way is going to be a threat to its neighbors. And I think that, any country that has a human rights record like Russia is going to have little regard for people living in countries next to it. And this is why I think, getting back to values, why values are so fundamental in foreign policy, and why human rights is such a fundamentally important thing in foreign policy. We don't talk about this just because we're nice humanitarians. We talk about it because it's in our strategic interests. Because countries that treat their people like this are threats to us. Countries that treat their people humanely are not threats to us. So I would like to see more rhetoric from the Trump administration talking about human rights. I was very dismayed to see President Trump call President Erdogan and congratulate him. Him, Putin, and a couple of Arab dictators. I mean, that is just horrible, awful.
Let me pick up on this. So you've got Manafort and Flynn and some other characters who are no longer around Trump necessarily, yet at the same time, you have Julia Hill, you have Fiona Hill, thank you. You have Mattis, you have McMaster. What's going on in Washington?
Again, it changes by the day.
And we've only got an hour.
Yeah. This is part of a broader question, really. I think you're asking, what is up with Trump and Russia? And I think there are two possibilities. There could be this secretive collusion that occurred. There could be secret slush funds. There could be financial indebtedness that Trump has to Russian creditors. There could have been cooperation between the Russian intelligence services and members of the Trump campaign. That's a possibility and should be investigated. And I support the investigations into it. But I also think that what we know already about Donald Trump and Russia is bad enough. And I think, for instance, all the nice things he said about Putin, the fact that he had Paul Manafort as his campaign manager. And I think to understand why the Russians wanted Trump is really not that difficult. And I've found myself having to explain this to my conservative and Republican friends. Imagine you're Vladimir Putin and you have two people running for president. One of them attacks NATO constantly, which is something no presidential candidate in America has ever done in the history of our country. Talks about America first, does not believe that America should have a leadership role in the world anymore, who thinks that the international system that America has built and sustained for 75 years is a scam perpetrated by foreign powers to swindle us. And on the other side, you have a liberal internationalist who's pretty much within the mainstream of American foreign policy. Who would you choose? You would obviously choose Donald Trump. He's a disruptive, disintegrative force within the Western alliance. And the way he's behaved over the past couple of weeks, who's he been alienating? Angela Merkel, accusing the British of spying on him. It makes perfect sense. So to me, that's why the Russians supported Donald Trump. And there doesn't need to be any evidence of secret, slush funds or whatnot. I think what Donald Trump represents in a foreign policy sense, there's actually a strain of this. You could say it's sort of a Jacksonian foreign policy. Andrew Jackson, who was a sort of intemperate nationalist president. And it is a legitimate foreign policy worldview. And it's existed in the United States for 150 years. It's just never gotten this far. It's never actually captured the White House. But it's always been there. And if you're a Russian, you would rather have that sort of isolationist, nationalist, populist. You would rather have that because that worldview would be more at ease with a Russian sphere of influence in Europe than the traditionally liberal internationalist view espoused by Hillary Clinton. So I think the Russians, they looked at this situation in the United States and they made a gamble, and they made the right gamble from their perspective. So I don't think we need these, ornate, elaborate conspiracies about that. A lot of liberals now are sort of they're becoming kind of conspiracy theorists in how they talk about Trump and Russia. I don't think any of that is necessary to explain what's happened. It's all evident to anyone who wants to look.
May I challenge you just a little bit?
Sure.
In practice, the United States has increased its gas supply, which runs directly in contradiction to the Russian economic interest, which is a big gas supplying economy. The United States administration has marginalized both China and Iran, who are Russian partners in adventures like Syria and elsewhere. The United States has continued sanctions on Russia, perhaps at the urging of both British and German leaders. The United States has also been acting towards indicating in Syria with the latest bombing that they will do things, which I think should be lauded, when regimes step outside of a particular understanding of what is appropriate action on the international stage. So in practice, the American administration is acting one way, even though the rhetoric of the president is really strange.
Yeah, and a lot of that is in spite of the president, not because of him. And I also wouldn't read too much into the Syrian strike. I don't think that launching 59 Tomahawk missiles obviates all these other concerns, these real concerns that exist about Trump and Russia. But I think I think it was a gamble that the Russians made. I think they knew what they were going to get with Hillary Clinton. They knew it. They'd seen her in office, and Putin personally blamed her for these protests against him in 2011. He had a personal hatred of her. They knew what they were going to get with Hillary Clinton. They didn't like it. They thought Donald Trump would be better. And I think that's probably what the assessment was of our own intelligence community that came to the conclusion that this is what they did. With the way, they probably did not think that he would bring on people like Mattis and McMaster.
Okay. So with that, I think it's now a great opportunity to open up questions to the floor. What I suggest we do is take 2 or 3 at a time, and then Jamie can kind of work his way through them if that's appropriate. For you in the back, please speak loudly if you don't mind.
I'm Julie Taub, I'm an immigration lawyer, and I'm also Jewish and Hungarian background, and I just want to add a footnote that you should perhaps be aware of regarding Hungary. Hungary chaired the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which consists of 31 countries in 2015. And at that time, for the first time in 70 years, it took them 70 years, they acknowledged their role in the Holocaust. They apologized in the United Nations. The Hungarian ambassador to Canada apologized at every single event that he organized during the year Hungary had the chairmanship here in Canada. Openly, publicly, at least a dozen times, if not more, that they had collaborated with the Germans, that they were responsible for what happened to the Jews, and that they no longer claimed they were victims of German occupations, but they were active collaborators with the Germans regarding the Jews. Since that time, all the Hungarian synagogues, the vast majority of synagogues, have been restored in Hungary, the Jewish cemeteries, there's been a Jewish revival. The attendance at Jewish synagogues in Hungary has increased. Number of Israeli students attending Hungarian universities has increased. There has been absolutely no net emigration of Hungarian Jews from Hungary. They're not going to Israel, they're not going anywhere else in Europe, they're staying there because at this time Hungary has become very tolerant and Jew-friendly. They've increased funding for all Jewish activities. So it's been a remarkable turnaround since the time they took on the chairmanship in 2015.
Thanks.
I just wanted to update you on that.
Thanks for the observation. We'll have Gene reflect on that for a second. Sir, go back.
Hi, my name is Bob Dale. I'm making my way through your book. Two things. First of all, it's an excellent book, but secondly, every time I finish a chapter, I get more and more depressed. Because what you've outlined there is mind-blowing. I mean, the disintegration of economies, the rise of the fringe right in the countries. I don't just think of countries disintegrating into individual countries. I think pre-Bismarck in Germany, where you have all these city-states. You've given some thoughts as to what you would like to happen, a stronger stand by the West and things like that. How realistic is it that the West, particularly led by Donald Trump right now, is really going to do something to turn the situation around? I'm just not sure, but I'm wondering what your opinion.
We'll take one more comment.
Andrew Zulis, Bearsley Street. You mentioned briefly when you spoke of Ukraine that was one area you felt there was some optimism that you had. Could you please explain a bit on that?
With regards to the Hungarian situation, I think the Orban government is very good at speaking out of both sides of its mouth. It'll tell international audiences the things that you said, yet domestically in Hungary it'll do things like this. It'll put up a memorial like that. And I think the driving, with regards to sort of the issue of anti-Semitism in Hungary, I don't think what's motivating this historical revisionism is really anti-Semitism. It's more nationalism. And the cost of this is the fact that, I mean, it's this desire to assert a sort of Hungarian victimhood and to justify the measures that the Hungarian government is taking. And a sort of consequence is that there is this sort of rewriting of the Holocaust. But it's not driven by, I don't see it as being driven by anti-Semitism. So I think it's possible for memorials like this and the historical revisionism campaign, it can coexist with restoring synagogues and chairing the International Holocaust Memorial Committees and sponsoring Jewish festivals. These are not mutually exclusive in their eyes. And I applaud them for doing those things, but I'm not going to let them off the hook for putting up memorials like that.
Holocaust is now a constant part of Jewish education, starting in 2015 in elementary schools. And this is not what I hear. This is what I get from the Jewish community in Hungary, because I have several friends. I speak Hungarian, and I am in touch with them. So it is not speaking out of both sides of the mouth, and it's not revisionism. They have changed the official policy of saying they were victims to saying we are collaborators.
Thank you.
The second question, is there any hope? I think that you both have the same sort of question on that. But the reason, if I see hope in Europe, it is from countries like Ukraine, because it is the first country where anyone died under the EU flag, and it is people who are fighting for values that we really take for granted. And I would hope that what's happening in Ukraine would sort of serve as a stark reminder to people in Western Europe about how precious it is what they have. Or it's countries like, Estonia, Latvia, the new members of the European Union, who I think, cherish these freedoms more than that we frankly take for granted. And there are, even in Western Europe too. I mean, what's happening in Germany now, the far right is being beaten back. There were moments just a couple of months ago when the Alternative for Deutschland was polling at 15 to 18%. They're now down to something like 6%. The main challenger, Angela Merkel, is a very, pro-European candidate, social democrat. Emmanuel Macron, I mentioned earlier, I think is who's young, fresh, dynamic. But it is still alarming to me that someone like Donald Trump could be elected president of the United States. And even if he loses in 3 years, or even if he's impeached, that will be a stain on my country. We'll always have to live that down. And the fact that something like this could happen really says a lot about, I think, the future of democracy. If in the world's greatest democracy, something like this could happen.
Okay, we'll take a few more questions. We'll start with you in the back.
One of the questions I had was,
Go ahead.
yeah. One of the questions I had was during the 70s and 80s, like someone like maybe like a religious figure like John Paul II did play a role in, I think, Poland, especially in some of the Eastern countries. And I'm wondering, do you see something similar? You mentioned Ukraine of involvement of, like, to maybe phrase the question better, what are the sort of spiritual resources of resistance that you have observed, if any?
Okay, so that's one. How about you?
Mr. Cohen, I wonder whether you've put too much of the blame on the situation in Europe, the disintegration, if you like, of Europe on Europeans themselves. I think there's probably an American role here too, especially in the last 8 years. The lack of leadership by Obama and his administration. I think you could possibly put some onus on him to say that this traditional American leadership, which has always been there since the end of World War II and during World War II, of course, it almost was invisible during the Obama years. And this, to some extent, could be, you could say, the drift you described could be ascribed to that. And I'm just wondering whether the advent of Donald Trump, unpredictable, mercurial, may well be something that in the medium term might be actually beneficial in that it gives people like Putin pause before he pushes on the open door that was Obama. He's not sure what the American reaction is going to be now.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So, spiritual centers of gravity, the consequences of Obama, and Dr. Crowley?
It so happens that just the other evening I was at dinner at the German ambassador's home where there was the vice chairman of the Canada-German Parliamentary Friendship Group, who's a Green MP from Germany and a member of the Defense Committee of the Bundestag. And a couple of things came out very interesting in the discussion, and without attributing them to anybody in particular, I would say there was a consensus around the room from the people from Germany. First of all, that Russia's invasion of Ukraine had changed Germans' views about Germany's role and the need to be strong militarily and the need to stand up to Russia in a way that nobody had expected. That it really, and I sort of figure if you have a Green member of the Bundestag and the Defense Committee saying something like this, something's happened. There was also a discussion about the German resistance to the surveillance state. One of the things you talked about, and again, the view around the table from the people from Germany was that incidents like the truck attack and other terrorist outrages have made Germans grow up and understand that they can't want to protect their privacy to an absolute extent and yet blame the government for not stopping terrorist outrages.
Right.
If they won't allow them to gather the information and the intelligence necessary to stop them. So a couple of interesting examples of how even in a very short period of time, it would appear that public opinion in Germany is shifting quite substantially.
Regarding the first question about spiritual resistance, I mean, I don't think we have. I mean, this is a much broader topic, but I mean, clearly Europe is becoming less religious. It's becoming less Judeo-Christian in that sense. And I'm someone who's pretty secular, but it's getting to the point where it's really disturbing in some countries when you look at these euthanasia laws that give me pause. So I don't see much of a change in that development. I see Europe becoming even more secular, at least Western Europe. I mean, even the more Catholic countries like Poland and whatnot. I think the younger generations are less religious than the older ones. So I don't see a reversal of that in the near term. Regarding your points about Obama, I absolutely agree with you. I didn't have time in my presentation, but I should have mentioned the reset with Russia, which Barack Obama was his first foreign policy initiative really coming into office, 6 months after the Russians invaded and occupied Georgia, for which there was no punishment whatsoever. And then we decided to reward them with a reset. And we were warned. There was a letter, an open letter published in the summer of 2009 that was signed by 22 leaders, distinguished statesmen from that part of the world, including Václav Havel and Lech Wałęsa and many others, who basically warned the United States from doing what it did. And you'll recall there was removing the missile defense systems from Poland and the Czech Republic on September 17th, the day that Poland was invaded, the anniversary of the day that Poland was invaded by Russia. Just to give you an example of the complete and utter tone deafness of the Obama administration. So I absolutely agree with you, and I think we're hearing all these lamentations from American liberals and supporters of the last president about the fate of the liberal world order. under Barack Obama. And I say to them, you know what, the liberal world order didn't really fare very well under your guy. And I think that these two presidents have a lot more in common in their worldview than either of them would be willing to admit. Neither of them, I mean, they're both sort of in some ways isolationists. Or they're both, I should say, they both don't, they both view, they're both skeptical of American power and America's role in the world. Obama comes at it from a left-wing, kind of universalist view, which sees American power as being sort of inherently corrupt. And Trump comes at it from sort of a bellicose America first view. But the end result is the same, which is America should basically do less in the world. And that's the thread that connects them. On your point, I'll take your point about Germans growing up a little bit when it comes to surveillance. I think that's a somewhat different issue from the American NSA and what we were doing in there. They're able to distinguish between the two of them. And as for German attitudes on Russia, I mean, there was a poll taken in the immediate aftermath of the Crimean annexation where it asked Germans, do you want Germany to take a position that is united with NATO in the Western Alliance, or do you want a middle position? And it was 49% for a middle position and 47% for a position with the West. That number's changed somewhat after the downing of the MH17 flight. But you still see in the German public debate today a real reticence when it comes to Russia. And the Social Democratic candidate who's running for chancellor has come out against raising their defense spending to 2% of GDP. Martin Schulz, the Social Democratic chancellor candidate, he is better on Russia than some of the other leading Social Democrats, like Sigmar Gabriel, the foreign minister, or the current president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the last foreign minister. But there is still, the German Social Democrats, the German left, are still thinking in the mode of Ostpolitik, which was, Willy Brandt's, opening to the Soviet Union. I would say a majority of the German people still believe that it was Ostpolitik that won the Cold War. It was basically Germans being nice to the Soviet Union, and that ended the Cold War. And there's no appreciation for, Ronald Reagan and the defense buildup and the Euro missiles that were deployed on German soil. It was sort of this narrative that, well, we had Gorbachev and he was a nice guy, and he, we had this people-powered movement and we all just kind of got along. And that is kind of that's kind of in the back of their minds. I think that really informs how the German Social Democratic Party views Russia. If we just talk and talk and talk more with them, then we'll be able to resolve all of our differences.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe two more questions, one more question. We'll start with one over here.
Elliot Tepper from Carleton University. I'll raise my voice and be classroom size. In terms of the future of Europe, either the institutional formality of the EU or the ethnic nationalism that you referred to and the reversion to a different kind of zeitgeist, doesn't this all come to a head almost immediately? In terms of Sunday, we have an election in France, and then followed by May 7th. This seems to be the pivotal moment where you can do without the UK, but you can't really do without France. So are we at that pivotal moment, and where do you see it going?
Okay. One more question. Sir.
Kevin Perry, I work for a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee on Parliament Hill. You mentioned the rise of sort of anti-Semitism on the left, particularly in the Labour Party. So I'm just wondering, I mean, I don't think we've found out where Ken Livingstone's position is going to be after this. But then you have someone like Rachel Reeves in Labour, who's sort of the traditionalist, like Blairite, prominently Jewish Labour MP. How do you square that? How do these parties sort of square that circle? And do you see sort of a clamp down on our Labour's efforts sort of just for public show? Is there an actual movement to try to sort of stamp this out? And is there sort of hope in other left-leaning parties in Europe about sort of stamping down on the sort of rise of anti-Semitism?
No, you're absolutely right. It is absolutely pivotal. And if the French elect Marine Le Pen, which is a very, let's say, it's a remote possibility, but I've stopped making predictions at this point. But if she's elected, then it's hard to see how the European project can continue. Because at that point, the French, it's interesting because the French want to stay within the Euro, even her own supporters, actually, a majority of National Front supporters want to stay within the euro. So it's bizarre. But if she wins, then it's hard to see how the European Union can continue to exist, because it can't just be Germany and a bunch of smaller countries. That's not an option. So, but I don't think she's going to win. So.
Overtly pro-European.
Well, no, Fillon is pro-European. He's very pro-Putin, which disturbs me. What's really disturbing is that 3 out of the 4 main French presidential candidates are just overtly pro-Russia. And what's incredible is that, it is public knowledge that Marine Le Pen took a €9 million loan from the Russians. She met with Vladimir Putin, all smiles and handshakes in Moscow 3 weeks ago. This has no effect whatsoever on the French public. That to me is worrying, that this does not have an effect, that this doesn't send a signal to people that, that why is this aggressive dictatorship, interfering in our politics? But then I could say the same thing about my own country. It was blatantly obvious what the Russians were doing all last year, and it didn't matter. The second question about labor, Ken Livingstone, for those of you who don't know, the former mayor of London, who seems to have trouble going a day without comparing Zionism to Nazism or saying that Hitler was a Zionist. Clearly a man who takes a perverse sort of pleasure in bullying Jews. Was suspended for 2 years, I think, and then it was a 1-year suspension, which is just appalling. I mean, this is the problem with anti-Semitism, is that if this were any other group of people, any other bigotry, if it was Islamophobia, which I know is a contentious word, if it was anti-Muslim bigotry, if it was anti-black bigotry, if it was anti-gay bigotry, there would be no debate about this. These people would be kicked out of the party and the door would be shut behind them. But for some reason, when it comes to Jews, there's this threshold where you're only deemed an anti-Semite if you literally have a swastika on your arm. Anything short of that, well, you're just a critic of Israel. And this is a real problem that people on the left in Europe have, and they need to confront it. And I'm worried. I mean, look, Labor's going to get wiped out in this election, but I think Corbyn wants that, and the people around him want that, because they want a smaller rump party where they can get rid of the Blairites once and for all, and that they can be prepared that when the revolution comes, the revolutionary vanguard of the Labour Party will take over. These people really believe this. They're really deluded Trotskyites. And you only need to read what Seamus Milne, the former columnist for The Guardian, who's now the communications director of the Labour Party. Go back and read this guy's columns. I mean, he's like an out-and-out Maoist. I'm not being hyperbolic. These are the people now running the Labour Party.
Okay, I want to conclude now, if you'll let me, by first of all thanking Jamie for being here, for his excellent talk, for taking all the questions we've thrown at you. We wish you all the success with your book. A reminder that there are copies in the back, $20 a piece. He'll stick around. You can continue conversation over coffee and a cookie, and he'd be happy to sign the book for you. I also want to take a minute to thank Cardis for hosting us. They're wonderful hosts with a beautiful space that they have afforded for us to have guests of your caliber to come and address a community of this caliber. I also want to thank the staff at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, David Watson, Juanita, where's the rest of our crew, Alicia, Allison, where's our intern? Shamil, where's Shamil? So Shamil stepped out, make sure you thank him. He was the guy at the front taking your registration coming in. We have a great team as we start building out foreign policy practices. Dr. Crowley alluded to, and Dr. Crowley, thank you for opening this and giving us the opportunity to put this group together. I'll close here. Stay in touch. You know how to get a hold of us on our website, and we hope to do more of these in the road ahead. Thank you.